Okay, let's get started here. And we'll keep letting people in as they come in. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for another virtual program brought to you by the Mattapoisett Museum. My name is Kyle DeCinco-Carey. I'm the president of the board of directors of the museum. I'd like to share with you, wait, I need my screen. Mission. Which we're very passionate about. We're a very vibrant place of learning and community activities. We collaborate and partner with surrounding communities to provide a place of learning and sharing. We collect, maintain, and make available for use cultural and historical materials relating to Mattapoisett's heritage, and very importantly, we create a welcoming place for people of all ages. Tonight, our program is, anyway, sorry, we're trying to do two things at once here. All right. So tonight, our program is offered you free of charge, but we do encourage donations to help offset the cost of this and future programs. Do we have an email survey prepared? It was in my notes. You may get an email survey about our event tonight. Your feedback is important to us, and if you don't get one, we still welcome your feedback. We love to hear from everybody what they thought of the program, what they think they'd like to see. We have some upcoming events that I would like to share with you. On Sunday, May 29th, we have old time fiddle sessions. That's typically the fourth Sunday of the month, but we had to reschedule it, so it'll be this coming Sunday. On Friday, June 3rd, we have silent film night. That's old movie set to live music. If you've never been, it's really fun to watch. On June 11th, Saturday, we have a program called A Day in the Life of an 18th Century Child with the we're hosting that with the Fairhaven Militia. And then on June 17th, we have open mic night at 6 o'clock. That's the third Friday of every month. And then we're partnering with our friends at the Mattapoisett Free Public Library for Rebels at the Sea, Privateering in the American Revolution, which is August 17th. And that will be at the library, not at the museum. And then we have, sorry, this is difficult. And then we have some upcoming online events, including early American baseball, the whale ship Essex, in a fun one, mass murder, which is infamous murder cases in Massachusetts, but we'll likely be adding more events. So you can check out our website at mattapoisettmuseum.org/events. And we encourage you to become a member. If you're not, if you love what we're doing and you want to support us, please consider becoming a member. We also have a lot of volunteer opportunities. We really want your support for you to be involved in everything that is happening here. We're all just like you. We like, if we weren't involved in the museum, we'd be sitting here watching this. So we really encourage you to get involved and to join us, and you can come hang out with us. You can there's lots to do. So Zoom etiquette is rules apply tonight, so please mute yourself for the event. If you have any questions or comments, just put those in the chat, and at the end we'll read them and we'll get you some answers. So if you would please welcome us Jennifer McIntire and Carole Clifford. And we'll switch off.
I will share my cancel. Oh, okay, good. My screen shifted as I tried to share my screen. All right, I will share my screen. There we go. So can everyone see the screen okay? Does that look clear to you? No technical problems? So Carole and I are thrilled to be here and share again our enthusiasm for history, Mattapoisett, and women's rights. So of course, there are many worthy women that deserve a recognition, both historically and today. But here we go. All right. So yes, so we're focusing on 4 women, and the way the talk will go is we will take turns talking about each each person that we've selected to focus on. And just by way of introduction, I'll just say that many traditional recordings of history have minimized or ignored the contributions of women, and the role of many women have played in the past, I think, should be revisited and considered through a lens that is less biased. So I think that looking at history and women, particularly, even in Mattapoisett, I guess you could say, we should be seeking to challenge or expand the traditional historical consensus. And historically, our society has taken a cautionary, I would say even maybe even hostile view of strong women. And if a woman didn't conform to sex stereotypical roles like wives, mothers, daughters, mistresses, they were often disparaged as arrogant, manly, shrill, hysterical. This value-laden perspective does a disservice to very bright, assertive women. And our group fills that category, bright, assertive women. So instead, we like to propose a celebration of strong women. And while many women of Mattapoisett's past deserve to be reconsidered in a more positive light, as I said, we are focusing on these four: Elizabeth Barstow Stoddard, Huybertie Hamlin, Minerva Sparrow, and Florence Eastman. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about the suffrage in Mattapoisett, and then give our speculations on how these women would have approached the suffrage movement. All right, so now let's see if I can change my slide. Ooh, I think we're good. The first person we're going to focus on is Elizabeth Drew Barstow Stoddard, and she was born in Mattapoisett, and the words I use to describe her is unconventional and ambitious, I would say. She was a novelist, she was a poet, she was a daughter, she was a wife, she was a mother, she was a mistress. She did have a brief affair with an actor named Edwin Booth. So Elizabeth was born in Mattapoisett in 1823, and she was the daughter of Wilson Barstow and Betsy S. Barstow. Her father was a shipbuilder and a ship agent, and he built more than 16 vessels from 1827 to 1856. And as a ship's agent, he was involved in many lucrative voyages, particularly in the range from 1842 to 1852. So she was the second of 9 siblings and 3 half siblings. And she was educated at Wheaton Female Seminary, which is Wheaton College today. In 1852, she married Richard Henry Stoddard. So in addition to editing books with her husband, she wrote, I'm going to switch my slide here. She wrote 3 novels. So she wrote The Morgansons, 2 Men, and Temple House. And she also wrote a children's book called Lolly Dink's Doings, and that was published in 1874. And she wrote a collection of poetry that was published in 1895. As for her literary reputation, I have some quotations for you. A man named William Dean Howells maintains that her work did not achieve the recognition that it merited. And he says that this recognition, which will be hers when time begins to look about him for work worth remembering. He also admired her integrity and commitment to cultivating an authentic voice. He says, in a time when most of us had to write like Tennyson or Longfellow or Browning, she never would write like anyone but herself. Sounds like her personality. So Morgansons is her novel that received the most critical acclaim. And as you can see, it's still available as a Penguin Classic from the slide. It's semi-autobiographical novel, and it's set in a town called Surrey, that very much it describes like Mattapoisett. And I'm going to read you the quote, kind of long quotation, but I think it says so much about her when you read the way this novel is characterized. This revolutionary exploration of conflict between a woman's instinct, passion, and will, and the social taboos, family allegiances, and traditional New England restraint that inhibit her. Set in a small seaport town, The Morgansons is the dramatic story of Cassandra Morganson's fight against social and religious norms in a quest for sexual, spiritual, and economic autonomy. An indomitable heroine, Cassandra not only achieves an equal and complete love with her husband and ownership of her family's property, but also masters the skills and accomplishments expected of women. Counterpointed with the stultified lives of her aunt, mother, and sister, Cassandra's success is a striking and radical affirmation of women's power to shape their own destinies, embodying the convergence of the melodrama and sexual undercurrents of Gothic romance and Victorian social realism. The Morgansons marks an important transition in the development of the novel and evoked comparisons during Stoddard's lifetime with such masters as Balzac, Tolstoy, Eliot, the Brontes, and Hawthorne. So really, it was one of the first great American novel written by a female author, I would assert. And it really reflects the difficulties of a strong-willed woman in New England in the middle of the 19th century. Many modern readers are really surprised by the book. They're really, and I think that once people read it, they're surprised it isn't more widely read, and also surprised by how feminist it is for its time, 1862. So really pretty interesting book. Actually, I list those other two, but I haven't read them. I only read the Morgansons. So I should get on that, I guess. So this I call the crabby portrait of Elizabeth Barstow Stoddard. Right now, I'll talk to you about her persona. Her appearance was often described as unattractive, spare, gaunt. And it's interesting to me that her appearance is described at all, because it's very difficult to find descriptions of male authors at this time, yet it's pretty easy to find a descriptions of her. So what am I doing here? I'm sorry. Her personality is often described as shrewish and with a proclivity to wounding and alienating old friends. She has been described as having repeated outrageous behavior, frail, intense, frustrated, abrasive. So there's one description I'll read for you that I found. Someone met her and described her as a woman of angular slimness, perhaps 43 or 44 years old. She wore a dull brown dress with an arabesque of white in minute pattern woven through the warp. The expression on her face and figure was withered like a brown leaf on a tree before the snow comes. No aura of charm whatever. So there you go. I mean, this is the thing. I think when people don't, when a woman didn't conform to stereotypes, they're often pretty seriously maligned. This is now I'll talk about the other side of Elizabeth Barstow Stoddard, the gentler view of Elizabeth Barstow Stoddard. She's also described as being deeply perceptive, had a very ironic view of nature, and a powerful and compelling personality. So seen in a more positive light, full of vitality, genius, brilliant, imaginative. So she's not this demure Victorian woman. She was direct, she was opinionated, she was frequently judgmental, and she was unafraid to enter into debate with, or even heated argument. So I think that, in my view, she should be considered a feminist. She found housekeeping antithetical to her life as an author. And after signing the contract for the Morgansons in 1961, she wrote to her husband and insisted he hire a housekeeper, someone to cook and clean for the family. She said, have a woman there to help me. I'm never going to do any more housework if I can help it. I am an author. So, but it is interesting, and we'll get back to this later as we talk about the suffrage movement. She stood aloof from organized women rights movements, and yet she did persistently acknowledge the many ways that social and legal obstacles prevented women from achieving personal and professional fulfillment, I would say. By her 30s, Stoddard was committed to a literary life in New York City. She earned money for her own writing and associated daily with other fellow authors. But on the other hand, too, I would tell you that motherhood was central to who she saw herself as. She saw herself as motherhood was important to her. And I just, in the chat, I included a poem that Carole had found that she wrote after her son's death. And you can just see how complicated a person she is, and truly, interesting person worth learning about. So I would say she's complex, she's unconventional, she's ambitious, and maybe she would have fared better had she been born at a different date. So now we will move on to Huybertie Hamlin.
Okay,
Carole will talk.
I'm muted.
You're muted? No, you're good.
I'm good. Okay. This is one of our, I consider one of the most interesting women that have lived in Mattapoisett. She's fascinating, actually. She's 1873 to 1964. Huybertie, Lanson, Pruyn, Hamlin. As you can tell by that brooch picture, she was born into a very wealthy family in Albany, New York. A family of people who were in the Continental Congress. She's an 8th generation Dutch American. She wrote about her life profusely. She wrote about everything that happened. So to even talk about it, you can only touch on certain topics because there's so much paper and writing available to read about her life. She chronicled everything. She did a series of stories called the Mattapoisett Chronicles from when she lived here. So she wrote about her childhood. She wrote about her ancestry, papers and papers. She wrote about Mattapoisett. She wrote about Washington, D.C. She wrote about politics. She wrote about our hurricanes. So this will be just a touch on some of the things she told us about her life and her life here. Next. As I said, the old Dutch family, we have that, and she, her childhood was pretty glamorous, is how to put that. This is a book that she wrote about her girlhood in Albany. Her father, as it says there, was a state senator and a U.S. representative. She took, as a child, she took 7 trips to Europe. She was considered living in the finest home in Albany. She had been presented to Queen Victoria when she was a young girl. She was a debutante. She was a lifelong friend of Franklin Roosevelt's. She ran a party for Grover Cleveland when she was 11 years old. So this is her background, which is going to be very different from a lot of the things here in Mattapoisett. Next. So people ask, well, how'd she get here to Mattapoisett? That's quite a background, and to be here living in Mattapoisett. This is a picture of her and her husband in 1929, but they didn't get married till 1898. So let's talk about how she met him, not how she met him, but how they came to be in Mattapoisett. His family came to Marion quite a bit, and they got married in 1898, And all of a sudden, about maybe the next year, she gets a phone call from Charles Hamlin, and he says, "Ooh, I just bought us a house." She knows nothing about it. She said, "Mattapoisett? Isn't that where it's hot and there's lots of mosquitoes? I'm not sure I'm gonna like this." But he's like, "Oh, Birdie, you're gonna love it." So they came down to visit at one point. And by the way, just to say, he himself, Charles Hamlin, was a Brahmin. You know, went to Boston Latin, went to Harvard, became a lawyer. So the family's a similar background in many ways. So she comes down here to Mattapoisett, and they had to crawl in a back window because the house was in such disrepair. It was the Shattuck. I said that wrong. Shattuck. If anybody knows old Mattapoisett, there was a house that was there next to the lighthouse, is where they are. And she wasn't thrilled at first, needless to say. He was very happy because it was part of a farm and he had farmland. He himself, as they lived there, became, he was assistant treasurer of the Navy, and he was the first chairman of the Federal Reserve. And as right away started to fix up the house. She actually had called it the ugliest house in Mattapoisett. Next. But in 2 years, they had added on a whole third floor. And there's a picture of that. And I love this picture because it shows, look where the lighthouse is, right there. Hardly any trees. So there they are. And the lighthouse is there, and the lighthouse keeper's house is right next to it. It's quite amazing. They ended up by 1901 having 31 rooms, and they had 40 acres of farmland. And she started to think of it as not a place to hide or retreat to or have summer. She really thought of it, I want to think of this Mattapoisett as my home. And she took that quite literally with what she did in Mattapoisett for the community. Next. Now, one thing about Birdie, when you read about her, she had kind of a sense of humor. Maybe not everybody would like her sense of humor, but I thought it was kind of funny. She's there in this picture with her daughter, Anna, and they have a bunch of puppies. And in the note, she's saying how she named them all for the members of the Federal Reserve Board and decided those would be good names for her puppies. And she names what some of them are. That would be typical of her to do that kind of a humor and think that would be funny. Just a little side story, and I'm not going to do it a lot about it tonight, but there's a lot of stories about Anna, how she died when she was 24 years old. It was very sad. She got sick and they had trouble, and they didn't really identify, or that I know of, exactly what she died of, but it really, and that was their only child. So there was sadness in their life from then on, of course. As it says there, they were lifelong members of the Mattapoisett Grange. And I put that up there because the Mattapoisett Grange was the center of a lot of social events. And I mean, I belong to the Grange. My grandparents belonged to the Grange. She went to the Grange Fair every year. So it shows how she embedded herself into the community with all the people. She actually went through all the degrees. I think he was a 50-year, or yeah. They get a little golden pin with a Schaefer wheat. I remember my grandfather had one. Anyways, so they're very involved that way in the town. But let's go back to her humor just a little bit. If you went there for dinner, she often would give you a jar or a glass that would dribble. And you'd be embarrassed, but she would chuckle a bit. She might give you silverware that wasn't balanced, and so it would fall on you. Charles himself was rather conservative, but he seemed not to mind her little jokes and the things that she did. She wrote an article about the difficulties of being a Democrat in Washington, and it's actually quite funny about taking over as the Democratic administration took over after Republicans one time, and what it was like to go to the parties and stuff with the Republicans. She wrote about her farm, and this is one of our favorite stories. When they first moved in, they didn't have any animals, and so she decided all her friends and family should send her animals. And she told them if they did not, she would name a pig after them. So they got animals, and they got a lot of them. One of them, a big, I believe it was a bull, maybe a cow, delivered to Charles's law office in Boston. And they're trying to figure out how to get it off out of that building and down to Mattapoisett. And then she wrote about somebody sent him a peacock, and she decided that the peacock was lonely and that he would crow a lot, and he would go up to the top of the lighthouse, according to her, and make noise and be very sad, and that he committed suicide one day, is what she said. But actually he was found dead at the bottom of the lighthouse, but she decided in sadness the peacock couldn't exist and flew himself off of the lighthouse. One of the things, I know that Mr. Anderson was here in the audience anyways, but David Anderson gave papers to the Mattapoisett Museum that his grandmother, Mary Ransom, was very friendly with a Huybertie. And one of the quotes from Washington, when she stayed there, and she was there a lot visiting President and Franklin and others, she said, "I'm sleeping in Lincoln's huge walnut bed. The back reaches up about 10 feet and is all carved with fruits and birds, a really hideous Victorian product. But I miss my dear Mattapoisett terribly. I find it hard to work or walk again after so many months. I want sand and woods. I love the peace and quiet. I love my little glass piazza, and I love my dear dogs." Next. One of the things, as we talk about the Mattapoisett Improvement Association, I thought I should start with, just to know, not like all things, nothing's ever really perfect. At one point, she owned the path going up from her house to the lighthouse and Beacon Street. And she owned land on both sides of Beacon Street, all the way down to the beach. And so when the town started to improve a bit, the road, what we would call Ned's Point Road, but actually the Beacon Street to the lighthouse, she claimed it was her land and it could not be used. And when she went to court, the lower court said she was right. And then the Superior Court said, no, Mattapoisett had a right to that path, which they made into a road. And so thank goodness when you think about it, otherwise we would never be able to get down to the lighthouse. But in spite of that, she was the Mattapoisett Improvement Association, and they were in this town for 50 years. And she was often, most of the time, I should say, the president of that organization. And so this is a booklet that actually talks about the 50 years of the Mattapoisett Improvement Association. There are books, there are little books about each one of the decades and what they accomplished in Mattapoisett during that time. So some of the things, just to show you how much she contributed and the people on that Improvement Association to the town we know today. There were 200 founding members. There were 15 board members, and she insisted that 6 of them had to be women. So there's a forward thinking for that time. And they knew they had to prioritize. The Fairhaven Improvement Association said, you know, don't go too far too soon, take your small steps. So they decided the very first thing they should do is take care of the rubbish in Mattapoisett, because everybody just did their own thing with their rubbish. So they started the rubbish collection. Then the next thing they knew needed improvement, they wanted a bathing beach, and they hired somebody to take care of the bathing beach. There were bathing houses at that time, more than one, and they did that. Then they thought the arch bridge, some kids, there was graffiti on it, and there weren't enough trees, so they planted over 400 trees in the life of the Mattapoisett Improvement Association. They fixed up the arch bridge. One of the fun things they did was to do street watering. And from her report there, you know, the dust in the street had really gotten bad. They couldn't get the water to where they needed to be. And I love the little last part was the Boston Park Commission sent us 6 barrels of oil mixed with soap. But on the way down, the oil and the soap separated. And so Mr. Mahoney had to find a way to mix it again. And it was sprinkled by the car on Church Street, but with really small effect. Salt water had been tried before, but it dried out too quickly. Tar was the next venture, and that was more successful, and it lasted 2 years. The trouble was that it spread unevenly sometimes, and a big chunk of it was dropped accidentally in front of St. Philip's Church, and on hot Sundays, many people blamed us for having big black stains on their white shoes. The Mattapoisett Improvement Association also did lawn parties every year. They helped the Boy Scouts do the Old Town trails that led to Marion. They did made sure the town had a visiting nurse. They made sure we had a town dental clinic. And at one point in 1940, they hired Dr. Teasdale. And if anybody else listening is a Mattapoisett kid like me, that's who we all went to the dentist up off of Route 6. They tried to make no signs in Mattapoisett, no billboards, but that didn't work for long. They're responsible for that plaque for the artist, Mr. Millay, down in the village on Water Street. They provided a phone at the railroad depot that anybody in the town could use. At one time, somebody complained about the cost of that, and they decided, no, it was worth it because people didn't have phones. They did the history of the cemeteries. They tried to keep track of the Civil War veterans, those kind of things. They wished we had a museum, and they didn't have one at the time, but now we do. And one of the biggest things was Shipyard Park. When the hurricane of 38 took everything down on Shipyard Park, they're the ones that said, oh no, don't build back up. When we want a park there, and got together with many other groups in the town that made it possible to have our Shipyard Park. They sponsored lectures, they did plays, they did Punch and Judy plays, and the Mattapoisett Museum had those puppets that she provided for that. They did the band, they did that stone pillar that's on the corner of Water and North Street by Ansel Weeks, and how he has set up the town. And then they did the garden committees, and they really thought it was really important for everybody to have beautiful gardens in the town. And they set up that you would get prizes as a child for different things and for adults. They set up prizes for garden and window boxes and for the best cucumbers. Don't know why cucumbers, but they were the special thing. And I know they did this because my mother talked about it, and how Minnie Tinkham up in Tinkhamtown would always win for the color of her flowers. But anyways, so they would offer the school children, and 97 sent in cards to enter the competition and the prizes. The first year were distributed at the lawn party, and all the children got ice cream, cakes, and candy. Subsequently, the annual party was given later when the gardens were older, and the committee had a special afternoon for it on the school grounds. I well remember a hot August afternoon when the committee went on a tour of the gardens. We had to go in the afternoon because Mrs. Curtis, who I think is going to come up later, a very interested member of the committee, never liked to go out in the morning. Miss Charlotte Parsons led the procession, driven by her coachman. They all had coachmen, Fraser, in a runabout. Mrs. Curtis with Mrs. Alice Stackpole drove in her grandmother's carriage. Mrs. Bacon and Mr. Hammond drove with me in our yellow fringe top Surrey. We ended the tour at the railroad station where Roger Sisson, who was about 15, he had entered for the best cucumber. We descended hot, but very serious about our work. We saw no signs of a garden. Miss Parsons thought she saw some hopeful signs across the tracks, and we all started over. Mrs. Curtis holding a parasol with a fringe over her head, but a voice from behind a window blind upstairs called to us, "Hey, were you looking for Roger's cukes?" Miss Parsons admitted we were. Well, Roger did grow a cuke, but nobody came to give him a prize, so Roger, he ate it. And that was their little trip for the garden tour, which a little bit of her humor in that also. And like we said, they did Boy Scouts and other things. They had trouble with the Boy Scouts at one point because one of the, as she said, one of the summer people came and took some of the boys to Boston and bought them uniforms and obviously weapons. And all of a sudden, one morning, they were getting phone calls from everybody because the boys had put on their shiny new uniforms and had taken and were shooting up old barn doors and anything they could find. And the boys had to be rounded up and the firearms were taken from them, much to their disappointment. So it gave the Boy Scouts a bad start in town with that. The Girl Scouts were organized later, and we all remember how that was well done by Annie Mendel and her co-workers. So this is our as an improvement associated, but this is also Mrs. Charles Hamlin is a driving force of this. Next. She wrote about a hurricane of 38, and she decided to call it the Log of the Ark, grounded on Mount Ararat, which is where she felt she was in that house. And if you know anything about the 38 hurricane, it came higher than every hurricane we've ever had. There are marks on some of the telephone poles down on the beaches that show how high it was. And this was the hurricane of September 21st, 1938. So we have some pictures of it there. But her story about it is that no one knew it was coming, which is true about the 38. And so she was taking a nap. And then the house began to shake. And so she woke up and she said, oh, I think it's a good plan for me to get dressed. And she said it was like an angry mountain range moving toward us, water all together, one half up to the lighthouse. No, well, at that time they wouldn't have had anything anyways, but constant noise. And she talks about how she was worried the house wouldn't stand up, her Mount Ararat house. And she talked about then when it's calmed down, the Civil Patrol did come and check on them. They took a walk downtown and everything was gone. Where Shipyard Park is now, you know, there was a Cooper, there was an Anchorage restaurant, there was a band stand, there was a sail off, there was a Cooper's place, and everything was just gone and everything was all up and wrecked all over. Crescent Beach and Pico Beach, there were only 4 houses left, and there had been over 160, just 4 standing villages in 1938. So she wrote this, there's a pamphlet about her writing about the Log of the Ark. It's fascinating, and I don't know if she sent it to magazines. She used to get published in magazines. She might have. But one of her favorite, the last line in the story is, I believe in miracles. She was glad that the priest at St. Anthony's and the Mattapoisett Congregational Church minister had said prayers. And then she said, you know, I always wondered what I would do in a real emergency. And now I know, nothing. As she just said there. Next. This is the last picture of Birdie. She's always doing teas. I know she did teas for the teachers in town. And I know she was a member of the Democratic Party, joined New Bedford Democratic Party. She had worked for John Kennedy to become president, to go to Congress. FDR often visited people in town, always talked about his boat was off the lighthouse at one point. Town was very excited about a trip from Franklin Roosevelt. Mrs. Wilson, Woodrow Wilson's wife, stayed in Mattapoisett for 2 weeks with her. And she was generous to a fault, actually. So at the end of her life, she was poor and could not maintain that house any longer, and herself, and was taking care of a family, Mr. and Mrs. Underwood, who were great people. And she was sad at that point. She had been a very civic-minded person, but then she said, you know, one must try to be philosophical and go along, not show, cranky old age, full of resentment. I have lived here since the candle and oil lamp period, and most of the changes have been to a great advantage. And I wonder how the famous Indian sachem who named Mattapoisett place of rest met a comet. I wonder what he would think of all our motor cars, our square dances, and our soapbox derbies. We could wonder how he would find Mattapoisett now, with all the parks, the trees, the shoreline, and the lighthouse. So if you ever get a chance, there's so much more about our Huybertie to learn about. She's quite a character, and our town reflects things she did when she lived here, still to this day. So now we go on to
Minerva
Minerva.
Sparrow. Okay, yeah, Minerva Sparrow was energetic, intelligent, and determined. And so Minerva was born in Mattapoisett in 1882, and her parents were William Edward Sparrow Jr. He was educated at MIT, and he was a bookkeeper. And her mother was Mary Atsat Sparrow. She had two siblings, Charles Atsat Sparrow and Seton Lee Sparrow. And her grandfathers were Dr. William Edward Sparrow, who built my old house, 6 Barstow Street, and John T. Atsat, who they owned the stores down at the wharf on Water Street. I'll show you this picture I put in because people claim, I don't know for a fact that it's Minerva, but everyone says it is. So that's the, accepted wisdom, or that, I guess. Okay, I'm trying to do it in the wrong place. Here we go. So she lived in the house next door to the museum where the Meninos live now, on Church Street. And she graduated from New Bedford High in 1900. She earned a bachelor's degree from Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts. She pursued a graduate work at Radcliffe and at Harvard and at Middlebury, and she earned her master's in English literature in 1927. I became interested in Minerva during the time when I was researching the history of the museum for our 60th celebration, our 60th anniversary. And while delving into old records, it became clear to me that Minerva was much more instrumental in the founding as well as the running of the Mattapoisett Historical Society than I had previously understood. And Minerva was really a can-do woman who saw potential and made connections. Once Francis Rowland came into possession of Lemuel LeBaron Dexter's extensive Mattapoisett document collection, the first person he consulted about starting a museum or a historical society for our town was Minerva Sparrow. So Lem Dexter, Francis Rowland, and Minerva Sparrow were all very involved in the care and maintenance of Cushing Cemetery. That's what brought them together. And she was also the person who encouraged Mrs. Dexter, after Lem had died, to endow the society. She essentially pointed out to, I think she was very direct to Mrs. Dexter, that they had no offspring. So who else was going to get her wealth? Why not donate it to the Historical Society? So that's what she did. She listened to Minerva. And when it came to finding a place for the museum in town, it was Minerva who set up the plan with the Old Baptist Church to become the Historical Society's new home. Just at this time, there was an attorney who was representing Fonts, a previous pastor at the church, and he contacted Minerva to ask if she would act as a trustee for an endowment they were establishing for the church. And he also asked her to recruit other trustees to create a board. And at the time, the church was really not in use. There was a small congregation, had been like 5 or 7, had actually dwindled down to 1. And Minerva assembled a group of trustees, and then the attorney had them officially appointed by the court. So the attorney also agreed to the use of the church by the Historical Society, and Minerva continued to volunteer for the Historical Society until her death in 1968. But I'm going to change my slide. Oh, that was supposed to be my slide for that talk part. This is the old pictures of, so this is Minerva's house next door. You can see it used to have a porch. And then here you can see her house is here next to the museum there. And then what happened was so I was learning a lot about Minerva Sparrow, and in a discussion I had with Carole about choosing women to focus on for this talk, I mentioned Minerva Sparrow, and as a woman I thought merited more attention. And Carole did some research and found that Minerva was much more impressive and accomplished and interesting than we had ever anticipated. Minerva was intelligent and highly educated. All she accomplished in the Historical Society, she did in her retirement. So when she was in her, she did all this for the Historical Society in her 70s and in her 80s. Prior to this time, she had a distinguished teaching career and a record of working with underserved populations. So her earliest teaching experience was in a small rural school in Acushnet. So that was right after she had graduated. She taught there from 1905 to 1907. And it was a one-room schoolhouse, and she taught 8 grades. Then she taught in Jacksonville, Florida, from 1907 to 1909. And I've not been able to find out that much information about this stint. From there, she taught at Rust College in Holly Springs, Mississippi. What's MS? Missouri or Mississippi? Missouri. Sorry. From 1909 to 1911. And then again, she came home and then went back 1918 to 1920. So Rust College was established in 1866 by the Freedman's Aid Society of the Methodist Episcopal Church. And its founders were missionaries from the North who opened a school in Asbury Methodist Episcopal Church and accepted adults of all ages as well as children for instruction in elementary subjects. So she taught freed African-American people. She was the head of the English department after that for Straight College from 1920 to 1935, where she taught Latin and English. Straight College is another historically Black college located in New Orleans and was established to educate freed slaves just following the Civil War. I'm going to switch my slide here. So she, following her tenure at Straight College, she went to teach at Pine Mountain. It's a school that was established in 1913 as part of, can you see my cursor? Because that's Minerva right there. Okay, there you go. She's in that group pic. But it was established in 1913 as part of what is known as the Rural Settlement School Movement. And these schools focused on educating the children of Eastern Kentucky and Southern Appalachians. And the desire was to transform the mountain community through education by infusing folk tradition with innovative teaching pedagogy. So she was very innovative for sure. She went to Pine Mountain in 1943, and so when she was 61 years old, and she taught there until 1946. She chose not to teach in 1947. She had some health problems, but then she returned in 1948 and 1949. So she was described by many children who were fortunate to have her as an instructor at Pine Mountain as one of the best teachers they had in their educational years. And I have some quotations. This is from Francis Yoakum, who knew Miss Sparrow in New Orleans. And he says, she took great interest in the whole student and tried to develop the good qualities which she found in each one. Though her students may have found her standards hard to attain, they ended by appreciating her and loving her. She comes from one of the old seafaring families of the Cape Cod region, whose characteristics of determination, forthright speech, and courage, and courageous optimism have appeared again and again as one of their in one of their descendants. From the former dean of Straight College, his name was Ludwig Art Larson, she received the following endorsement. I consider her the best teacher of English that I have known in 40 years of experience. She's a woman of fine Christian character, very thorough and conscientious, and at times having the view, all the time having the view, the best good for her students. That's kind of hard wording for me. I cannot speak too highly of her. So Minerva was not only accomplished and energetic, she was generous and sympathetic. I think we found that she was truly an inspiration once we learned more about her. So we are going to move on to Florence Eastman. Let me move my, oh, that's her set, that's her stone in the cemetery. Just if you want to go find it, you can.
Okay, my turn to do Florence Eastman, and a lot of you know about her already, especially when we started to have this COVID time because of her experience with the 1918 quote Spanish flu. Anyways, Florence grew up in with lighthouses. She was the daughter of Russell and Ida Eastman, and he had been, she was born in Somerville, but her father was a lightkeeper in Truro, and then he became a lightkeeper in Dennis, and then he became a lightkeeper here in Ned's Point Light in 1916. So she was already older when she got here and spent some time here, but probably not a lot. But they moved to Ned's Point Lighthouse. This one says 1915, I see 1916. They do different, they're always a little off on the dates, we're not sure. But next slide. Just a little quick review of what the lighthouse was like then through the different, it's been different over the years. This is the first, as you notice the bird cage top to the lighthouse, which we don't have anymore. And there was always a stone house with it. That's prior to 1888. Next. This would have been the lighthouse as she knew it. And now we have the top that we recognize. And there's the house that would have been there, a wooden house this time rather than a stone house. And they lived there, and he was the last light keeper at this particular one. What I was going to say is when the lighthouse was first built, it was built, you know, down on Ned's Point. Ned's Point's named for a farmer who owned that land, Ned, and he sold it, and they built the lighthouse there. And they had a local shipbuilder build the lighthouse to start with. And he was a shipbuilder, as I said. He owned some salt works, and he also owned a tavern. And he was unable to build the lighthouse on time. He was having trouble. So when the people were coming, the inspectors were coming to check on the lighthouse, it was not ready. So he had them stay at his tavern a little while, enjoy themselves, have some good time there, and hoping that they wouldn't notice a whole lot of things when they went down to the lighthouse. He had his men, the floor wasn't finished, so they put loose planking over barrels for the floor, and they hoped for the best. But when they went, the inspector stepped on the end of one of the planks and went to the bottom of the lighthouse. He wasn't injured, but he was very angry. And but it was finally finished, and they said it was okay. But the first lightkeeper there said, it's awful. It leaks everywhere. It leaks on the top through that birdcage part. It leaks down the walls. It's awful. And when they came and tried to do some repairs on it, they realized that it built of stone from the beach, but it was just when they would take the mortar out, a lot of it was just sand between the rocks. So it wasn't the best built at first, but it had that special staircase, the cantilevered staircase right into the wall, which you can still climb to this day. And that's kind of special. That's 32 steps. It was unusual. It was low enough to, some lighthouse keepers complained because they couldn't wear a hat when they went up top. Because you gotta keep the light going. Sometimes you're hauling whale oil over to keep it going. And it can never be left unattended. So when it would leak, you'd be there trying to keep the light lit. So it was a problem from the beginning in a way. Next one. And then it finally was decommissioned, and he was removed in 1923. And I love the stories about it. And this is her father, Mr. Eastman. He was the last one there. And they say when they sailed the lighthouse across the bay that he stayed in it. And one story is he stayed in it cooking his breakfast as it crossed the bay out here. They were sending it to, let's see, I get it the right, they say Wings, Neck, and Bourne. And the other one story with it is that he was determined to stay a lightkeeper. And when they got over to the next lighthouse with this house to use there, he stayed with it because he didn't want to lose his job. But I actually think the one about the breakfast may be a little more true. That's the one told most of the time. Next. But let's talk about Florence. And just thought a little brief history of the lighthouse helps everybody get a little, and it was just broken into yesterday. Terrible. Anyways, she was passionate and she really wanted to work for the Red Cross. She was determined to make more of her life than just staying in the lighthouse, obviously. She was very self-disciplined. So she trained as a nurse when she was about 17 years old. She graduated from Morton Hospital in Taunton. She completed advanced classes at Mass General. She was a night supervisor in a hospital in Dartmouth. For a few months, she was in Concord, New Hampshire. For a short time, sorry, she was in Jamestown, New York, but she always wanted to be a Red Cross nurse, and they enroll in the Army. So when they they dropped requirements to become a Red Cross nurse to 23, she immediately joined. And she was first assigned to Camp Upton, Long Island. And she was then transferred to Camp Mills. And this is where she became the head nurse in an isolation hospital. And as you look at it, you realize she's right at the time when the flu is hitting. And then that flu hit young soldiers probably the most. So you would get at her hospital, the isolation hospital, she would get soldiers coming back from World War I, coming from World War I, and sick with the flu. She was put in charge of 22 nurses and 100 soldier orderlies coming in. And we know during that flu, we lost a lot of lives. We lost more than 500,000 worldwide, and mostly young people. But she never faltered in her duties. People said, she said, I'm always going to be there to take care of my boys. But as often happens with the kind of infections like that, she caught the flu and she died October 14th, 1918 at the age of 24. She had just got her passport to go overseas to be with the Army in World War I. She's often referred to as the angel of the wards. Next. Just to show, this is her death certificate that from Camp Mills, Florence Eastman, and you see they call it influenza. And they have some of the details there, her parents and her address for Mattapoisett, Mass. Next. This is, they named, I'm trying to think about how to start this one. They named the Florence Eastman post after her, which is unusual to be named for a woman to begin with. And she is our only volunteer that did not come back from World War I. This was our first building for the post. And it used to be a school in Mattapoisett. It was up on Route 6. And they moved it to Depot Street where it stands now. There was a, when she, okay, next, I think the next slide. Okay. All right, just want to see where I am. There's a tree planted at the library that you can see in her memory, and they honor her every Memorial Day, which is coming up with a flag there. When she died, the Army had a flag draped coffin come to Depot Street. Huybertie, who lived at the lighthouse, next to the lighthouse, got a call that the body was in town, and she went and picked up the parents, because they didn't have a car, to come and follow the flag draped hearse. It was followed with a military escort walking beside it all the way to the lighthouse. Huybertie reports that the funeral was attended by about 20 people at the lighthouse in the living room. It was bitter cold. It was about 3 o'clock, and Birdie stayed behind because you can never leave a lighthouse unattended. So she did that, and then she wrote, and it sounds so sad. I was left there alone while the sad little party passed down the long, rough little road to the Ned's Point Road. And she's buried at Pine Island Cemetery, which you can see now, can go, whatever. And the only thing I had left was, because it's not much, she didn't live long, her devotion to duty, her cheerful disposition, her sympathy to sick soldiers, won her the respect and esteem of all with whom she is associated. So that's our story of Florence Eastman, a young girl who didn't spend a lot of time here, but certainly has made a mark on Mattapoisett. And I think most people are very familiar with her name. Well, because the post is named after her. So now we're doing some suffrage and suffragettes.
So I'll give a little context, and then Carol's going to speak more to what happened specifically in Mattapoisett. But as in other parts of the country, the women's rights movement in New England grew out of efforts to abolish slavery. So in 1837, noted female abolitionists known as the Grimke sisters, Angelina and Sarah Grimke, toured New England and staunchly defended a woman's right to speak and to speak out in public against slavery. New England's most notable early suffragist was Lucy Stone of Massachusetts. And in 1847, Stone delivered her first lecture on behalf of women's rights at her brother's church in Gardner, Massachusetts.
I want one second, just because it's a little fun. They used to call all the women that followed her stoners. And you know, nowadays it stands for something else, but that
can mean something else. Soon after, she moved to Boston and began a paid position lecturing in Massachusetts for the Anti-Slavery Society. Stone enraged some audiences by daring to criticize women's lack of rights alongside her condemnation of slavery. In 1850, Stone and several other New England women organized the first National Women's Rights Convention in Worcester, Mass, to see if they could generate support for suffrage around the country. In 1868, they formed the New England Women's Suffrage Association. So this association soon became embroiled in the national debate over the 15th Amendment of the Constitution, which would prohibit denying the franchise based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And the 15th Amendment passed in 1870. It's interesting. New England suffragists used the argument of social housekeeping, that women would clean up urban politics and social ills, to make a case, as that was their argument for allowing women the vote in starting in municipal elections, not in broader elections. But it's also everything is complicated, right? The suffrage movement that started with abolishing slavery and being proponents of the 15th Amendment, then adopted a rather racist and nativist strategy of educated suffrage, which argued that educated, usually white, native-born women were more deserving of the vote than ignorant Black and immigrant men. And although educated suffrage could theoretically include a small number of educated Black women in the country, white suffrage organizations excluded or marginalized Black women. So during the 1910s, there was really a renewed effort among suffragists to demand for a federal amendment to the US Constitution, granting women the right to vote. And this is really when the crusade began to be felt in Mattapoisett. So I will change the slide for Carole.
Okay, and to add on to what Jen just said, in 1879 here in Massachusetts, it was allowed that women could run for and vote for school committee, because they considered that like it's okay for women to do school committee. And Huybertie actually had meetings at her home in 1905 trying to call people to go out and vote for the school committee, and was shocked that people, when they had the right to vote, didn't vote. This is our suffrage movement in Mattapoisett. This is an article from the Boston Sunday Post declaring how Mattapoisett at Mrs. Curtis's house was the pro-suffrage movement in Mattapoisett. And immediately after that was set up in Wareham, they set up the anti-suffrage. And it was a lot of society women going down to the Cape to do campaign all over conservative Cape Cod to sway women one way or the other. Mrs. Curtis, who came down here, was from Nahat, and she had been involved in suffrage right from the very beginning. And she set up her house, the picture down, the very last house on the bottom. It's a very small print to see all of that, but that's the house that she was in at the time, and that's a picture of her up at the left. There were several newspaper articles about all of this. I'm not sure, I think the next one is, but next, let's see. Yeah. In the Fairhaven, this is the Fairhaven Star in 1913, to Mrs. Curtis and Miss Margaret Foley, who was really an activist, met in Fairhaven and tried to get people to sign cards to advance for the vote. Miss Foley gave a speech that she said, they called it vocal fireworks. There is, threw out a few pieces of vocal fireworks, which are likely to be used as ammunition by the antis. There were 200 people at that meeting. What she said to be vocal fireworks was, there's a difference between a suffragist and a suffragette. Suffragettes have backbone, and the suffragists just have a wishbone. Suffragettes are going to win the vote. Suffragists are just going to want a vote. And they thought, well, that's going to give ammunition to the antis to use that. She's so outspoken, let's put it that way. So that's the atmosphere in the two towns. Miss Curtis did her speech, and she said, you women down here in the Cape, you must think about the poor girls and mothers back in the cities, toiling every day for their daily bread. You must think how to help them. You must fight for the vote. Convince your husband, your boyfriend, your sweetheart that they must give you the same rights of suffrage that they enjoy. Next. I think there's another. Okay, before we do this one, we also had one here in Mattapoisett where it was at Town Hall, and it was the pro-suffrage women had just left, and behind them pulled up a car, as they said, all in blue, white, and American Beauty, which is for the color red. And they came into the town hall to talk against the suffrage as they just left. They felt that women should be out of politics. We don't have any place for that. Just follow your husband. Do the duties of motherhood and home. Suffragettes are